The committee will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to examine how we build a 21st century infrastructure for America in the context of economic development and disaster resilience. First, as the chairman of the subcommittee with oversight over FEMA, we are working closely with the members, states, and communities devastated by Hurricanes Harvey and Irma. Our thoughts and prayers go out to the families and the communities that are impacted. I also want to acknowledge the brave and tireless work of the thousands of first responders, volunteers, and members of the federal family that are helping respond to these catastrophic storms and pave the way for recovery. I've seen firsthand how disasters can upend and devastate communities. The loss of homes, jobs, cherished belongings, and most tragically, lives. We must work to ensure the states and communities impacted by these hurricanes recover and recover quickly. And in recovering, it becomes even more critical to ensure that we rebuild smarter and better. It will not serve anyone well if we simply rebuild without incorporating mitigation measures that will minimize the impact of future disasters. Investment in mitigation ensures the wise investment of taxpayer dollars because mitigation strengthens infrastructure, saves lives, and reduces future disaster costs and losses. Today, I hope we can find ways to ensure mitigation is built into our building and rebuilding process so that we can save lives and property. Critical in the recovery following a disaster is ensuring businesses and jobs return. Agencies like the Economic Development Administration, or EDA, provide critical assistance to help with economic recovery following a disaster. For example, in the district I represent, many businesses were impacted by floodwaters during Tropical Storm Lee, threatening businesses and hundreds of jobs. EDA's investment of $15 million for flood control systems in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania, leveraged an additional $15 million in private and local investment and saved nearly 900 jobs. Today, we also want to explore how we can strengthen economic development programs to more effectively leverage private investment in infrastructure and create jobs. And we want to examine how we can build and rebuild better to save lives, strengthen our communities, and reduce disaster costs and losses. But the mission of agencies like EDA and the Appalachian Regional Commission, or ARC, extend well beyond natural disasters. Federal economic development programs often provide the last piece of the puzzle distressed communities need to attract private investment, businesses, and jobs. For example, ARC's Partnership for Opportunity in Workforce and Economic Revitalization, also known as the POWER Initiative, invested $9 million in Pennsylvania that will attract $33 million in private investment and create over 600 jobs in coal-impacted communities. The grants from these agencies are usually tied to specific outcomes that increase their impact in distressed communities and ensure jobs are actually created and other goals achieved. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on how these programs work and what programs exist to improve upon them. In rebuilding our nation's infrastructure, we cannot do it alone. It takes all levels of government and the private sector. How do we maximize these economic development and disaster response programs to ensure good outcomes and quick recovery while creating lasting jobs and economic growth? I'm sure our witnesses today will help us answer these questions. I thank you all for being here. I now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Johnson, for a brief opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning. I wish to extend my condolences to those who've lost loved ones during the recent hurricanes, and my thoughts and prayers are with the survivors of both hurricanes. I wish them a successful recovery. Given the recent back-to-back hurricanes, which also went through Atlanta and other parts of Georgia as a storm, today's hearing on the importance of resilient infrastructure and promoting strong economic development is timely. The American Society of Civil Engineers, ASCE, has noted that the nation has an infrastructure deficit. In fact, the ASCE has graded the nation's infrastructure a D+. Between 2016 and 2025, ASCE found that households will lose $3,400 each year in disposable income due to infrastructure deficiencies. Loss of individual income affects the ability of businesses to provide well-paying jobs, which in turn further reduces incomes. If this investment gap is not addressed by 2025, ASCE determined that the economy is expected to lose almost $4 trillion in gross domestic product, resulting in a loss of 2.5 million jobs by 2025. While the sorry state of infrastructure has a devastating impact on our national economy and its citizens in ordinary times, during times of disasters, it also increases costs. Hurricane Harvey damage estimates range from $100 billion up to $180 billion. Swiss Re, a private reinsurance company, estimates that Hurricane Irma damage could cost $100 to $300 billion. The infrastructure damage caused by these hurricanes will negatively impact and affect the local economies with business disruptions and workers left jobless or at least temporarily unemployed. The nation cannot afford to continue on this path. We must rebuild, but it must be stronger, safer, and smarter. While devastating, these hurricanes provide the affected areas with an opportunity to be more resilient going forward. For those communities that are not affected, this should be a wake-up call to invest in resilient infrastructure before disaster strikes. Studies have shown that investments in mitigation before disaster strikes saves $3 to $4 for every dollar spent on mitigation. FEMA's pre-disaster mitigation program provides grants specifically for this purpose. By all accounts, FEMA's PDM program is working, which is why it is so baffling that President Trump proposed to reduce PDM funding by over $60 million in his fiscal year 2018 budget. He wants to build a wall rather than put America's infrastructure and the American taxpayers first. But President Trump has gone further. Instead of requiring communities to build back stronger, last month he revoked the federal flood risk management standard. This standard would have required infrastructure projects built with federal funds, such as those the hurricane-impacted communities are about to undertake, be built back more resilient. This standard would have required projects to be rebuilt to one of three standards: the 500-year flood standard, a reasonable requirement given that Texas suffered its third 500-year flood in 3 years. Using client science-informed data, or constructing critical infrastructure 3 feet above the base flood elevation and other infrastructure 2 feet above the base flood elevation. President Trump would be wise to follow the old adage, if something isn't broke, don't fix it. We have an opportunity to diminish future losses. Let's not throw it away. Congress needs to look out for all taxpayers and require these impacted communities to recover smarter and stronger where federal funds are used. This is the only way to end the cycle of build, damage, rebuild. After a disaster, all sectors need to recover. FEMA estimates that up to 40% of small businesses do not return after a disaster. This means we need to invest in economic development activities in those areas and elsewhere. The Economic Development Administration, EDA, has a disaster assistance recovery program that affords local communities the flexibility necessary to recover economically after a disaster. As Congress looks at supplemental appropriations for disaster-affected areas, this committee must ensure that funding is provided for this program. For years, regional organizations in other parts of the country have successfully assisted local communities in achieving economic development through infrastructure investments. While Congress has authorized the Southeast Crescent Regional Commission, Congress has only appropriated minimal funding, and the President has yet to appoint a federal co-chair that would allow the commission to become operational. My district, which is within the commission's boundaries, has an unemployment rate of 8.9% and a poverty rate of 15%. We are already behind, and my district cannot afford to lose $3,400 per year due to infrastructure deficiencies. It's time for EDA to be reauthorized and adequately funded, and the Southeast Crescent Regional Commission must be stood up so that my district can experience desperately needed economic development. Investment in resilient infrastructure works, and is one of the best tools to address unemployment and poverty and reduce disaster costs and losses. President Trump has called for infrastructure investments, yet has not provided a plan forward. Not only that, he has proposed to eliminate EDA and the only regional organizations despite their success. Congress needs to ignore President Trump's ill-conceived proposals and support local communities by reauthorizing funding for these proven programs. Thank you, and I look forward to today's testimony.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Schuster.
Thank you, Chairman Barletta, and thank you and Ranking Member Johnson for holding this important hearing today, exploring what our nation needs to build a 21st century infrastructure. I want to welcome Mr. Siegel, whose seat ACOG encompasses counties that are near and dear to my heart: Mifflin, Juniata, Snyder, Perry County, great places that I used to represent. And now I believe Mr. Barletta and Mr. No, not Perry. Perry has a piece of that too, but so does Marino. Yeah. So again, great part of the state of Pennsylvania, and I miss them very much because they're strong Republican bastions. So, anyways, I was happy that Mr. Perry and Mr. Barletta and Mr. Marino got that part of the world. Again, before we start, also I want to offer my condolences to those who have lost loved ones and to the families that were affected by Hurricane Harvey and Irma, and our thoughts and prayers are with them. Also want to recognize the professionals at FEMA who are working night and day to manage the disaster response to those hurricanes, as well as across the states. They're responders, as well as the folks in the local communities. It's been a terrible tragedy, but again, watching America pull together, it's always makes you feel proud and renews your strength and belief that America is the greatest nation in the history of the world. When these tragedies strike, as we've learned with Katrina, Rita, and Sandy, we need to be able to effectively help the people in those communities impacted. And from a policy perspective, we can never stop exploring ways to improve and invest in those disasters and preparedness, response, and recovery, and how these programs and capabilities can be improved. I know the folks from the Build Strong Coalition are here today, and they're doing great work on, I've been to their facility in South Carolina. I think they burned a building the day I was there. But they can blow a building up. But it's a great facility. I'd encourage everybody to go down there and see it. And the work they're doing is really great work, so that as we rebuild these communities, we're learning the lessons from what those folks are doing and that industry is doing to make sure that we're doing the right thing as we rebuild these communities. I expect our witnesses today to address the critical issues. I know we got a great a panel here today. But investment in infrastructure goes beyond disasters. On the economic development side, we have communities all across this nation, struggling coal communities, small Appalachian towns communities that are suddenly hit by disasters, and businesses are closing. And I know where I come from in Pennsylvania, it's all small and rural communities. So this is an incredibly important aspect of what we do. For many of these communities, agencies like EDA and ARC provide the technical expertise and the seed money that need to spur the economic growth and create and save jobs. So it's incredibly important, I know, across the country, but certainly I know in my district and in Congressman Barletta's district and in Mr. Johnson's district and his state, there's a great need for it. So I look forward to hearing from witnesses today. And again, I want to everyone affected by the hurricanes that have just occurred, we know that, as I said earlier, they're in our thoughts and our prayers, and we stand ready to help rebuild and recover those areas. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We now welcome our witnesses. On our panel, we have Mr. Bill Siegel, Assistant Executive Director of CEDA Council of Governments, Mr. Justin Hembree, Executive Director, Land of Sky Regional Council, representing the National Association of Development Organizations, Mr. Brett Doney, President of CEO Great Falls Development Authority, Great Falls, Montana, representing the International Economic Development Council, Mr. Steve Linkus, President and CEO of Hartford Mutual Insurance Company, National Associations of Mutual Insurance Companies, representing the Build Strong Coalition, and Ms. Jessica Granis, Adaption Program Manager, Georgetown Climate Center. I ask unanimous consent that our witnesses' full statements be included in the record without objection, so ordered. For our witnesses, since your written testimony has been made a part of the record, the subcommittee would request that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. Mr. Siegel, you may proceed.
Thank you, and good morning. Good morning, Chairman Barletta, subcommittee members, and guests. I'm Bill Siegel. I'm the Assistant Executive Director of CEDA Council of Governments, a regional local development agency serving 11 counties in central Pennsylvania. On behalf of CEDACOG and the nearly 750,000 residents of our region, thank you for the opportunity to share our perspectives on infrastructure needs and the role of the federal government in our region. We are a rural region, historically defined by agriculture, anthracite coal, and manufacturing. Today, we are challenged to redefine ourselves by maintaining and growing our manufacturing sector while building our service industries. We look to the federal government to partner with us as we confront these challenges. Roads, bridges, and rail are important, but not to the exclusion of flood resiliency and technology in our 18th and 19th century communities. The funds offered through the Economic Development Administration, the Community Development Block Grant Program, the Appalachian Region Commission, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, to name a few, are critical catalysts for our infrastructure projects. How do we build a 21st century infrastructure in America? In central Pennsylvania, it's through federal, state, local, and private partnership. Partnerships that protect and enhance the infrastructure in which we've already invested, and by complementing that investment with new infrastructure that allows the region and its industries to remain competitive. Allow me to share a success story. The town of Bloomsburg, as the chairman made reference, is located on the banks of the Susquehanna River, and until recently was the only municipality on the Susquehanna without flood protection. Autoneum North America, a manufacturer of automotive carpet, today employs over 650 workers with an annual payroll of over $30 million. If you traveled here today by car, you likely placed your feet on their carpet. Autoneum faced a serious dilemma. Located in the special flood hazard area, their 100-year-old plant flooded every several years. If they chose to remain at this location, they placed themselves in risk of financial devastation, as is evidenced by their $60 million loss in 2011. The entire automotive manufacturing system and supply chain was slowed by the unavailability of automotive carpet while Autoneum struggled through shutdown and recovery. It affected the entire nation. Relocation out of the flood hazard area had similar impacts due to lost production time ripping through Detroit. They could not stay, they could not leave. But after Hurricane Lee and Tropical Storm Sandy, long-term customers began to waffle at contract renewal and to investigate alternative suppliers, including foreign suppliers, to avoid the cost of flood-induced shutdowns. In 2014, CEDACOG and the Columbia County Commissioners were successful in obtaining a $15 million EDA grant to construct a flood protection system around Autoneum. With the EDA commitment, we leveraged $12 million from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, along with $2.5 million of private funds to construct a $30 million flood control system. CEDACOG staff managed the funding and the project. We broke ground in 2015 and completed the project last year, under budget and ahead of schedule. I recently learned that several of Autoneum's major customers had placed contract renewals on hold until we broke ground for that project. Without the partnership of the federal government through EDA, it is with near certainty that I can say we would have lost this manufacturer, leaving the town of Bloomsburg without the employment and with 42 acres vacant manufacturing facility falling into blight and generating little to no taxes. Protecting the existing infrastructure in this example, Autoneum North America, is a priority of CEDACOG. Using the federal tools such as EDA, CDBG, and FEMA pre-disaster mitigation, CEDACOG is able to incentivize public and private partners. EDA's support of LDDs allows us to develop and maintain a caliber of staff that otherwise would not exist in rural Pennsylvania, and which is critical to leading the economic and community development activities. In deference to time, I would conclude by saying in order to build a 21st century infrastructure, we must continue to partner at all levels of government and business to address all three legs of this stool. We need to first maintain what exists, we need to protect it from the new threats, and we need to expand it to become globally competitive. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Siegel. Mr. Hembree, you may proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Barletta, Ranking Member Johnson, members of the subcommittee, for the opportunity to testify this morning on infrastructure and EDA's role in aiding rural and distressed communities. My name is Justin Hembree. I'm the Executive Director of Land of Sky Regional Council. We're a public entity dedicated to economic and community development and headquartered in Asheville, North Carolina. I'm also a board member of the National Association of Development Organizations, known as NATO. NATO is a member-based association of more than 350 regional development organizations throughout the country. NATO provides advocacy, education, research, and training to members, including 368 EDA-funded Designated Economic Development Districts, or EDDs. NATO members support local governments, communities, and economies through regional collaboration, comprehensive planning, and program implementation. I come before the committee to speak on EDA's role as a key facilitator of economic opportunity for distressed and underperforming communities. Since the creation under the Federal Public Works and Economic Development Act of 1965, EDA has provided direct financial and technical assistance resulting in business and job growth, especially for small and rural communities. From fiscal years 2012 to 2016, EDA steered $2 billion towards local and regional initiatives, leveraging nearly $39 billion in private investment while helping to create and retain 321,000 jobs. Infrastructure investments are a major part of EDA's assistance to communities. A good example is the agency's recent investment of nearly $400,000 into a sewer line expansion and wastewater system upgrade for the small town of Mars Hill, North Carolina. The funding addressed additional capacity needs for the town's wastewater treatment plant due to an expansion of Mars Hill University and Advanced Super Abrasives Company, as well as the creation of a new industrial site. The sewer line also contributed to business expansion along the I-26 corridor And overall, EDA's investment leveraged at least $585,000 in local and state funding. The projects helped to create and retain 95 jobs with a private investment of $35 million. The project also shows how EDA serves as an integrator of public and private resources. EDA identifies and invests in projects in part based upon participation from local and state partners. EDA investments also combine with resources from other federal agencies such as HUD, Department of Agriculture, and the Appalachian Regional Commission. EDA also offers loan servicing for small businesses. EDA's revolving loan fund responds to the challenge of cost and access to capital involved with small business startup and expansion. EDA loan funding is often the last resort for small businesses seeking resources to launch and grow operations. Loans are managed by economic development districts to provide direct local oversight and compliance between lenders and loan recipients. To improve local processes, NATO has recommended the suspension of RLF's burdensome reporting requirements following loan repayment. A defederalization of the loan would cut unnecessary requirements currently endured by local administrators. As Congress considers a proposal to rebuild our nation's infrastructure, EDA remains a strong resource to assist in federal, state, and local economic development activities. Strategic movement of federal resources will be key to ensuring taxpayer dollars are directed to the greatest infrastructure needs. EDA offers both a successful record and structure responsive to local and regional needs in infrastructure development, especially in rural areas. Again, thank you for the opportunity to address the subcommittee. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Hembree. Mr. Doney, you may proceed.
Good morning. On behalf of the International Economic Development Council, our board of directors, and over 5,000 members, thank you, Chairman Barletta and Ranking Member Johnson, for inviting me here today to share our perspective on this critical issue. Before delivering my prepared remarks, I would like to note that our full testimony includes a report written by our Economic Development Research Partnership of IEDC titled Critical Condition Infrastructure for Economic Development. I would also like to take a moment to thank you for your kind remarks in appreciation of disaster recovery and response workers and volunteers. Across Montana and the West, we're fighting thousands of fires right now, and there's a lot of people this morning working out there protecting lives and community. As economic developers, every day we work with businesses of all sizes to help them start up, expand, address adversity, and take advantage of new opportunities. Infrastructure is often a deal-breaking challenge to overcome. Iconic projects such as the Erie Canal, the Hoover Dam, and the Interstate Highway System reflect investments that revolutionized the economic futures of the people and regions they touched. In economic development, more often we're challenged with smaller but no less critical infrastructure needs. Gaps in our local infrastructure that prevent businesses from creating the higher wage jobs desperately needed in too many of our communities and regions. EDA has been a critical partner in overcoming these deal-killing infrastructure gaps. Our challenges today are greater than ever before. We need your help to ensure that EDA remains an instrumental resource and partner in helping those of us on the ground at the local level get things done. In my submitted testimony, in addition to the detailed report on how economic developers work with infrastructure, I provide a few examples of successful projects that have taken place in my community. I am happy to discuss these and answer questions about them, as well as our statewide Montana Infrastructure Coalition. But I will use my time to discuss suggestions for how economic developers might like to see this committee proceed as it addresses our infrastructure crisis. There are two opportunities we'd like to highlight for EDA to advance infrastructure for the purpose of economic development. First, as has been discussed by this committee in the past and by Mr. Hembree, the defederalization of revolving loan funds will allow communities to leverage existing funding with state and private sector funding to potentially great impact. Second, the advancement of the Division of Economic Development integration at EDA would result in streamlined processes and leveraged federal investments with the outcome of a better, more coordinated federal engagement in local economic development efforts. I would also like to point out one other opportunity for your consideration. Economic recovery following disaster is a critical component to restoring communities. The National Disaster Recovery Framework identifies the Department of Commerce via EDA as the lead federal agency on economic recovery. Yet the department was left out of Sandy supplementals. We encourage the members of this committee to ensure the department is included in future supplemental related to Hurricanes Harvey and Irma, hopefully also the Western fires, as well as any future legislation regarding the role of the federal agencies in disaster response and recovery. It has been suggested in explanation for calling for the elimination of the Economic Development Administration that the Department of Transportation could fulfill EDA's role in infrastructure. This demonstrates a lack of understanding of the type of infrastructure that EDA supports. The most straightforward description would be to consider it as last 100 yards infrastructure. These are the sewer lines and rail spurs running into industrial parks and manufacturing plants that DOT money does not cover. These are the renovations of existing buildings that take the idea of a business incubator in a small town to reality. These are the expansion of broadband capacity that allows a Rust Belt city to move into the 21st century. These, to put it a different way, are the targeted, locally driven, strategically planned investments in infrastructure that EDA makes that no other federal agency does on a national scale. We encourage this committee to look to the strengths of EDA and the regional development agencies, their institutional knowledge of local economic needs and abilities, and invest in them. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Doney. Mr. Linkus, you may proceed.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Barletta, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me today to testify. My name is Steve Linkus, and I am the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Hartford Mutual Insurance Company. I also serve as Chairman of the Board of Directors of the National Association of Mutual Insurance Companies. NAMIC is a founding and executive committee member of the Build Strong Coalition, on whose behalf I am testifying today. Founded in 1842, Hartford Mutual Insurance Company has grown from a small local insurer serving homeowners and farmers in rural Bel Air, Maryland, to a regional company protecting policyholders in 7 states and the District of Columbia. One of the reasons we have been providing property and casualty insurance products to our policyholders for over 175 years is the mutual insurance model, where policyholders are put first. Hartford Mutual is a member of NAMIC, the largest property and casualty insurance trade association in the country, with more than 1,400 member companies. As we've seen in recent days, now is more important than ever to consider the devastating and growing impact of severe disasters. And during this critical time for everyone in the path of these hurricanes, we commend the leadership of Chairman Barletta, who has never wavered in his mission to reduce disaster losses and better protect communities ahead of the next storm. As victims recover from the massive destruction left behind in the wake of Hurricanes Harvey and Irma, we should remember that the storms have not only destroyed lives and homes, but will have a devastating effect on the local economies for years to come. According to FEMA, 40 to 60% of small businesses never reopen their doors after a disaster. And 90% of smaller companies fail within a year if they cannot resume operation within 5 days. But it is not just small businesses that suffer the long-term effects of extreme weather. Rather, catastrophes have lasting ramifications on entire communities. A recent study by the National Bureau of Economic Research shows that counties hit by severe disasters experience greater outmigration, lower home prices, and higher poverty rates. As they wreak havoc on our economies and communities, natural catastrophes are also drastically increasing in frequency and severity, and creating an enormous burden on the nation's taxpayers. Between 1976 and 1995, there were an average number of only 39 annual federal disaster declarations. This number has skyrocketed to 121 between 1996 and 2015, during which we experienced Hurricane Katrina and Superstorm Sandy, storms that resulted in almost $180 billion in combined federal aid. And many expect the combined aid sent to victims of Harvey and Irma could reach $200 billion. While victims of catastrophes like Harvey and Irma should always be the first priority, we owe it to America to drastically change our approach. We will always help victims get back on their feet, but I believe we should be doing more to keep them from becoming victims in the first place. Research has shown repeatedly that pre-disaster mitigation and more resilient construction is our best line of defense in the face of disasters. But the federal government has taken a reactive posture, spending 14 times more on rebuilding communities after instead of preparing before the catastrophes strike. We have the science and the ability to do better, and we must implement a national strategy for investing in disaster mitigation in order to protect lives, communities, and taxpayer dollars. First, we must incentivize states to adopt and enforce safe construction standards. As part of this critical reform, essential assistance made available to communities after disasters could be used to develop and enforce such standards. Next, we must shift reactive post-disaster mitigation dollars to a new National Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, where funds could be used by communities to protect homes and mitigate risk before a disaster strikes. Additionally, Congress should adjust the federal minimum cost share following a major disaster based upon a state's resiliency. We should not treat states that put responsible mitigation measures in place the same as those that needlessly leave lives and homes vulnerable. Finally, the federal government should respond more efficiently to victims of disasters like Harvey and Irma by consolidating all federal disaster assistance programs under FEMA. As Congress and the President work together to help the victims of disasters and improve the nation's infrastructure, the time has never been more urgent to adopt a national strategy for investing in disaster mitigation, which will save lives, property, and billions of taxpayer dollars. Chairman Barletta, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you again for holding today's critical hearing. I look forward to answering any of your questions.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Linkus. Ms. Kranis, you may proceed.
Thank you to the distinguished members of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee for inviting me to testify on this important topic. My name is Jessica Granis. I manage the adaptation program for the Georgetown Climate Center, an institute based at Georgetown Law that supports state and local efforts to reduce carbon pollution and prepare for the impacts of climate change. Part of my work focuses on how federal programs can better support state and local efforts to prepare for future climate impacts. This year of record-breaking weather and devastating impacts provides a sobering preview of what we can expect with greater frequency and intensity as the climate changes. Sea level rise, more intense heavy downpour events, and more extreme heat will increasingly affect people, property, and infrastructure. These events have also had significant economic and fiscal impacts. According to NOAA data adjusted for inflation, we saw an average of $2 billion disaster events per year in the 1980s. That number has risen to 10 per year since 2010. And 2017 is likely to break yet another record as the most costly year for natural disasters that this nation has ever experienced. It is essential to talk about resilience now as Congress makes billion-dollar decisions about how to fund long-term recovery. A fiscally responsible approach does not put communities back to the status quo and in harm's way. Congress should require that federal investments account for anticipated future conditions and provide incentives to encourage communities to take proactive steps to reduce their own risks. Many cities and states are already taking action. Miami Beach, Florida is investing $500 million to elevate roads and install new pumping systems, which the mayor reported helped the city avoid some flood losses during this week's Irma's storm surge. After impacts from Hurricane Sandy, Fort Lauderdale rebuilt Highway A1A to provide additional flood protection, and cities in the Midwest, like Chicago, are upgrading their sewer systems and deploying green infrastructure to better manage the increasing rainfall that is already overwhelming their antiquated systems. Federal agencies have also been developing common sense measures that ensure that taxpayer dollars are not being wasted. After Hurricane Sandy, disaster-affected communities were required to build back stronger. FEMA is also requiring states to consider climate change and hazard mitigation plans. Congress should support and encourage these types of proactive federal agency actions. Although promising resilience practices are being developed at all levels of government, much more needs to be done to help our communities respond to the increasing threats, and Congress should lead these efforts. First, Congress can reform and modernize federal disaster recovery programs under the Stafford Act. Rebuilding to replace exactly what was damaged or destroyed to the pre-storm standards is not the responsible nor the fiscally prudent thing to do in an era of climate change. Congress can require recipients of disaster recovery funds to consider climate projections when reconstructing infrastructure with disaster recovery funds. Reinstating the federal flood risk management standards that required projects using federal funds to build to higher standards would be a good start. Congress should fund the programs that provide science and technical assistance that help state and local governments understand their risks and design assets to be more resilient to future changes, including supporting FEMA's floodplain mapping program. Congress can also simplify and harmonize administrative requirements for deploying disaster recovery funds to enable state and local grantees to more easily combine funding streams and reduce red tape for both grantees and administering agencies. Second, Congress should fund and encourage communities to proactively implement measures to reduce risks by funding FEMA's pre-disaster mitigation program. More help is needed for communities preparing for other impacts like extreme heat, droughts, and wildfires. Congress could also consider FEMA's proposal to create a disaster deductible, which would allow communities to be rewarded for the mitigation measures that they're already implementing on the ground. Finally, much more investment is needed in sound infrastructure even without disasters. Congress could create and fund and consider infrastructure banks that are being deployed at the state level, or even look at a national infrastructure bank to enable private sector investment in upgrading and enhancing the resilience of U.S. infrastructure systems. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss some common sense actions that Congress can take to build the resilience of our communities and our nation. More information about these examples is available in my written testimony and on our website, and I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, Ms. Granis. I will now begin the first round of questions, limited to 5 minutes for each member. If there are any additional questions following the first round, we will have additional rounds of questions as needed. I ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. With that, I will begin the first round. Mr. Siegel, as you point out in your testimony, economic development funding was critical in saving hundreds of jobs in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. Can you talk about the challenges small and distressed communities have in attracting private investment, and how do economic development programs help address those challenges?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. The challenges we have in the small and rural communities of the ACOG region begins with the fact that many of our communities have very limited staff. One of the important things that the Economic Development Administration, as well as the Appalachian Regional Commission provides, is support to organizations such as City Council of Governments to actually step in and serve as virtual staff to these communities in pursuing and then administering the federal funds that are available. That's the same service that we provide to small businesses as they try to develop. We not only support communities, but we support the individual businesses and provide financing and assistance in pursuing and obtaining the funding that's necessary to move their projects forward.
And Mr. Siegel, as you know, there are many coal-impacted communities in Pennsylvania. How have EDA and ARC helped in getting these communities back on their feet?
Thank you. Currently, the Northumberland County and ACOG are working jointly on a project that was actually funded through the POWER program that you referenced earlier. That program is to assist coal-impacted communities, and while the program is aimed principally at current coal-impacted communities, the reality is that within the ACOG region, the anthracite coal was key to the development of this country many years ago. They are still impacted communities with the loss of the anthracite coal industry that has declined. The POWER program has provided us an opportunity to utilize over 6,000 acres of coal-damaged land located in lower Northumberland County in the anthracite fields. And that acreage was virtually vacant. It was destroyed through many of the mining operations and disposal operations. And today we have converted that and are in the process of converting that into the anthracite outdoor activity area. We're sponsoring Jeep Jamborees, four-wheel drive off-road Jamborees, and it has turned into an outstanding economic development engine for that otherwise distressed community. Currently, the projects include the construction of communications towers so that we have connectivity. Earlier comment was made about broadband and the importance of that in our region, and I have many examples of that critical need. Roadways, camping, and spin-off businesses associated with the anthracite outdoor area, which was funded through the POWER program. So I offer that as an example of the tools we use.
Mr. Linkus, I know it's too early to tell the full extent of the devastation caused by Hurricane Irma, but we have heard about the many changes Florida made following Hurricane Andrew to reduce the damages, the losses and costs from future disasters. Are we able to gain any lessons learned from Florida as to how we as a nation can strengthen our infrastructure to withstand the next disaster?
Thank you. Absolutely. As we've seen from some of the terrible images coming out of Florida, there's been a dramatic shift due to the building codes and seeing the resiliency to the storm that hit compared to Hurricane Andrew some 25 years ago. Senator Nelson recently, as he flew over the state, commented to CNN that he was able to clearly distinguish between buildings that were built pre-Andrew and post-Andrew. So it went to prove very dramatically that sensible and strong building codes can have a dramatic impact in protecting lives and the building properties that are all around them. Unfortunately, events like Andrew come along every now and then, and we are devastated by their impact, but we certainly learn from them, and Florida certainly shines as an example in this country where they took the opportunity to increase their building codes, enforce their building codes in order to make their state far more resilient. In many ways, Florida was lucky with Irma in the way she took her path. A direct strike on Miami that is at a very low flood level already could have been devastating. And I think that as the state continues to see more disasters head their way, enforcing these building codes across the state and as we migrate these across the country will be extremely important to saving lives and property.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ranking Member Johnson for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Ms. Granis, what is the long-term funding impact of rescinding the federal flood risk management standard, and has your organization studied the long-term fiscal impact of implementing the standard versus not implementing the standard?
We have not studied the long-term, we have not studied the long-term fiscal impact of implementing the standard or not implementing the standard. I think what we do know is from the figures that you pointed out earlier, a dollar in mitigation saves us $4 in costs avoided. And the federal flood risk management standard was to implement a common sense mitigation approach to make sure that when we were building infrastructure with federal dollars, it would be either elevated to account for the future flood risk that we are seeing in our communities now and that we expect to see with greater intensity and frequency in the future, and to encourage people to think about relocating infrastructure out of floodplains and out of high hazard areas so that they're not as exposed to those flood risks in the first place. So that would be a good metric to look for when you're funding disaster recovery dollars this time around.
Thank you. What is the order of magnitude of funding necessary to fund resilience in a manner that bends the cost curve on disaster funding?
Another great question. As a lawyer, I don't have as good a sense of the economics case for some of these investments that we need to make in terms of pre-disaster mitigation, but I would say, again, the numbers that have come out of studies in the past, that $1 saves $4 are a good metric, and we have other studies that look at other mitigation approaches like in restoring and enhancing natural floodplains and the amount that can help communities reduce their flood impacts are a good benchmark to look to when looking at federal investments.
Thank you, Ms. Granis. Mr. Linkus, do you think that there will be a difference in property damage between Florida and Texas due to the different emphasis on the use of building codes?
Thank you. Most certainly. We saw that in Houston, especially with the flood impact, that it's estimated that only 20% of the flood victims actually have flood insurance, whereas flood insurance is owned by nearly 80% of those affected in Florida. I think this speaks to the state's preparation of not only their own infrastructure, but also communicating to the citizens of their states the importance of having those protections at their disposal.
What about the use of building codes in Florida versus lack thereof in Texas?
Well, certainly, as I mentioned earlier, we've seen that in Florida, it's very clear the distinction between those homes and buildings that are built to the newer standards. In various parts of the country, the building codes are mandated either at the state level or even at a county level, and they can vary widely. On top of the building codes, an important factor is the enforcement of those codes, especially in rapidly developing communities. The resources at the county and state level are so limited that it makes it difficult to even enforce the higher standards that are there. Florida has put forth money to make sure that the enforcement is in place, and certainly what we have proposed to Congress in our Build Strong coalition is that there are funds available to those communities to make sure that they are trained, licensed, and enforced when dealing with these building codes.
Thank you, Mr. Hembree. In 2009, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act provided funding for the Economic Development Administration. Are there any lessons learned from implementation of that act that could be incorporated into an infrastructure bill so that members of your organization could use funds more efficiently?
Absolutely. I think if you look at the lessons learned from our implementation of those funds through that program, we found that a lot of times construction ready doesn't really mean construction ready. I think what we found through that process was that there needs to be more flexibility at the federal level, working with EDA's regional offices to move those funds quicker through to help us implement the projects that we know are in place. I think the other thing that's important with that is an understanding that sometimes from the federal level with these programs, one size doesn't fit all when it comes to the types of projects that funds are dedicated to or being directed to. Mainly when you're talking about rural and distressed communities, there's various different needs and different capacity at the local level for the ability for organizations to effectively administer that type of program that was such a large amount of funds trying to be moved out in such a short period of time.
Thank you. And now you're back.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Ferguson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your testimony today. One of the things I want to comment on is my experience as a mayor in using EDA funding. And two examples that I have, we had a revolving loan fund that we used to stabilize buildings in our downtown. And it was pretty effective in closing the economic viability gap in some of those instances, going in and providing funding that traditional lenders simply would not touch. And what we found, we had a high level of success with that. And then we also had success using EDA grants for that last mile of infrastructure on water and sewer projects. The net result is that we were able to create about 16,000 manufacturing jobs in our community and revitalize the downtown, and these were two important tools that we used. One of the things I'd like to get y'all's thoughts on, we touched on rural broadband. One of the things that I've seen going into rural areas, and my part of Georgia certainly has a very rural component to it. Can you imagine, or can you talk? Have y'all ever thought about rural broadband development and how a revolving loan fund or a grant program might be used for that? And Mr. Hembree, I'll start with you on that.
Thank you. I've actually not given any specific thought to the revolving loan fund program as part of a broadband initiative, but just in terms of my knowledge of the way that program works and some opportunities that are there, I think it could certainly work, particularly, at least in North Carolina, we have to take the approach based on some state statutes. All broadband projects have to be public-private partnerships. Localities can't control or operate broadband systems as a utility. So an RLF program or a grant program could certainly provide funds that would facilitate those types of partnerships to make it work. The challenge that we face, and I think all of us face across the country when we're talking about rural broadband, is that in terms of our economic competitiveness, in terms of us being able to have the ability to compete on the national and global market, we have got to have that connection. But the flip side of that is the density is not high enough in rural areas for the market to drive deployment of those resources and those infrastructures to the areas. So that's sort of the catch-22, and where EDA and other programs could step in to fill that gap.
And that's my point in that, is that, you know, a lot of times we will use either the grant program or the revolving loan fund program to close the economic viability gap in these other types of economic development projects. And I think that we all recognize that the rural broadband infrastructure is really critical to really making sure that we stay competitive on a global stage. But quite candidly, it's really the best way forward for rural America. It's the way that we connect young people in those communities to economic opportunities in the metropolitan areas. And I would say that beginning to change our model for economic development, maybe moving away from traditional infrastructure projects to putting a heavy emphasis for the next few years into broadband development and tying that directly to our education system to develop students that can use this to earn a living, I think is pretty important to do. So whether it's a revolving loan fund or a grant program or whatever it is, I think we need to look at this maybe the same way that we have traditionally putting in water and sewer lines for an economic development project. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Ms. Norton for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I thank you for this hearing, which I must say, unfortunately, is very timely in light of recent events. I think this question is really for Mr. Linkus. Am I pronouncing your name correctly? Because of a suggestion in your testimony. In my own district, the nation's capital, the threat of not hurricanes, although that does happen here, but certainly of floods on the mall are imminent, and we were just finished working through this committee, constructing a levee there, and I have 2 bills where construction is underway now, literally on the water, the southeast waterfront, the southwest waterfront. This is fairly typical of building in the United States. So the notion of protections not only against disasters like hurricanes, but of surges, of floods, is nationwide. Now, in your testimony, Mr. Linkus, you proposed something very interesting. First of all, you say in your testimony that only 15% of those affected by Harvey were covered by insurance. That ought to shake us up. I can't imagine how we're going to rebuild when you pile on Irma and the rest. And you're making a suggestion that I'd like to have you justify. It's perfectly understandable that you would focus, as the Congress has not sufficiently, on pre-disaster funding. And so you proposed that 10%, and here I'm reading from your testimony, of all funds appropriated for the existing post-disaster hazard mitigation grant program be allocated to a new program, a new mitigation program, where funds would be available with regards to whether a disaster occurred and could be used for strengthening homes and businesses. So essentially, you want to take funds from disaster funds. It's kind of tough love to make perhaps the Congress and maybe even the states do what they haven't done in the past. Have you concluded that the only way to get sufficient attention on pre-disaster funds is this kind of tough taking from Peter to pay Paul, as some would say? If you say to Sandy, for example, which is still going on, the rebuilding there, that part of those funds, which I must tell you they had a harder time getting than it looks like we're getting for the Texas and Florida disasters. If you were to say take away 10% of the funds that are being used to rebuild New York and New Jersey and set them aside for whoever needs funds, we're likely to get members from those delegations saying, really? So would you explain why you've come to that conclusion and if you think it would be successful here in the Congress?
Thank you. You know, a wise person once said that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And as we know, that was Benjamin Franklin, who also happens to be a founding father of our mutual insurance industry, and his company continues 265 years later in Philadelphia. I think we need to take that sage wisdom when we go into addressing our nation's disaster recovery. As we've heard, $1 equals $4 on the back end. And if we continue to...
Everybody in the Congress will give lip service to what you have just said. But you've cited in your own testimony that sometimes 80, I think one of your figures, the amount go into post-disaster, then Congress has been willing to put into pre-disaster. So everybody believes it, but it's in our DNA to help people when a disaster has occurred, but cannot be found anywhere. Apparently among Democrats or Republicans, they take a big chunk of money and use it for pre-disaster, even though you won't find any member who disagrees with what you just said. So I'm really looking for the remedy. Do you think this notion of saying, okay, you are willing to generate funds after disaster because you have no, really have no alternative. So if there's a provision that says some of that money has to go into pre-disaster, then maybe we'll build up a pre-disaster mitigation fund. That's what you seem to be proposing. And I'm asking, this taking away from a disaster to play for the next disaster, whoever gets it, it might not even be the particular, jurisdiction. I'm asking you, do you think that that is really all that's left to do now to get Congress focused on the importance of pre-disaster funding?
I agree with you that we must focus on recovering those that are impacted by Harvey and Irma or whatever the major disaster they may be striking in the nation. Our priority must be first and foremost there. That being said, what we have laid out is simply incentivizing states to take measures to prevent the damage that would come from the next hurricane. Whether we like it or not, the frequency and severity of weather events are increasing on a dramatic pace. Our funding of these events from a disaster situation on a post-disaster basis is unsustainable. We will not have the funds to continue.
People who lose funds, let's say people in New York and New Jersey, having these funds taken from their post-disaster funds, would they be available to them for pre-disaster mitigation?
Yes. What we're recommending is taking a set percentage of the annual funds that are coming out of disaster relief and setting them aside for pre-disaster mitigation. As you mentioned, 10%. So if $200 billion was in the package for 1 year, we would be setting aside $20 billion for the states to recover. One key element of what we're proposing is also having FEMA oversee all dollars that are being spent on a disaster basis. Billions of dollars were set aside for Sandy. Most of that should have gone to New Jersey and New York, where the disaster actually happened. But as we know, slush funds were created across the board that impacted 25 states that got Sandy relief funds. So we believe that there's sufficient dollars within the disaster recovery funds that can be utilized toward pre-disaster mitigation.
I think it should be considered. As tough as it is, I think that the gentleman's proposal should be considered. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Faso for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Linkhouse, I recently met with a mutual insurance company located in my district, and as you know, we had significant damage due to Irene and Lee back in 2011, as did the state of Vermont. And all through the Catskills, we had serious flooding and property damage. And one of the things that the folks from the mutual company told me was that, ironically, the people who did not have flood insurance, they received compensation quicker than the people who had flood insurance. And I'm wondering if you could comment on that and what your experience and the opinion of your association and your coalition is on that topic.
Thank you. Well, certainly when we are proposing recommendations to Congress, one of them is not to have insurance programs run by the federal government. We know that the large bureaucracy that is created around FEMA creates problems when it ultimately takes place in delivering a check to an affected business owner or homeowner. We as mutual insurance companies are based in the community. We were formed because of the community. And we are there to closely monitor their impact and can have a far quicker and more responsive mitigation of their disasters because we are there. When you take it to a federal level, you are inherently going to build in some lag of time as the government is dealing not only with the flooding, but also the impacts of the hurricane and infrastructure, gas shortages, and everything else that inherently get in the way. We would call for more privatization of the flood insurance program. We have put forth key elements to revitalizing the flood insurance program, one of them being allowing data to be supplied by the flood insurance program to the private market so companies like us could assess that information. Right now, that information is only in the hands of FEMA. In order for us to adjust the rates according to the exposure so that it does not jeopardize our companies, we need that information at our level in order to do that.
So streamlining the information, making it accessible, in your view, would allow for quicker compensation for those that are adversely affected by these events.
Absolutely.
And I don't know if Ms. Granis or another member of the panel would like to comment. One of the things I hear consistently from people in my district is the dissatisfaction with the FEMA mapping process, and that this process is often convoluted, filled with mistakes, et cetera. Could the panelists, Ms. Granis or any of the other panelists, care to comment on that issue?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I think that's a common critique in many communities, that the floodplain maps are under-predicting what actually floods during these events, that FEMA is underfunded to update the maps. Many communities have maps that are many decades old. We've looked at solutions to try to have federal agencies work better together. You have a multitude of different federal agencies that are collecting data relevant to flood risk: USGS, FEMA, NOAA. So creating a facility that allows those different data sets to be combined and used to more easily update floodplain maps and give communities better flood risk information. So I think when looking at the National Flood Insurance Program, looking at options for improving FEMA's floodplain mapping program is going to be really key, and also giving FEMA the funds they need to make sure that those maps are up to date and accurate, and including future conditions information for communities.
Any of the other panelists have a thought on this issue?
If I could just add as well, myself as a company, we're looking at multiple exposures: hurricanes, severe convective storm, tornadoes, severe weather events. We utilize modeling companies in the industry, RMS, AIR, to provide us data. They change their models, if not once a year, multiple times a year, based on the information they're receiving from the disasters. The more disasters we have, unfortunately, provide more data to us to be able to deal with those. When floodplains are changed on a multi-year basis, we know immediately that they're out of date. And so it cannot be used as a basis to adequately charge a rate to the consumer or a business that is in a floodplain, or even for them to determine, are they truly in a floodplain to begin with. And so we need to update the data, as Ms. Granis said, and that would certainly go a long way to supporting the federal insurance flood program. Last thing I'd say on flood is that we all have to understand that the rates being charged by the NFIP are pre-subsidized. So the dollars that are determined internally to charge for a risk is already subsidized when it reaches the consumer. We're giving them a false sense of security by them thinking, oh, it only cost me $500 for my flood policy. It must not be a big risk, when really it's been subsidized by 90% by the federal government. More importantly, we know that there are some living in those flood-affected areas that can't afford the higher flood rates. But there are many that can afford the higher flood rates, but we are pre-subsidizing across the board and not looking at this in the proper way. And we've called, NAMIC has called for many changes in the NFIP that we would look forward Congress to passing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Smucker for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for holding this hearing, which, of course, is timely in regards to disaster relief and mitigation, and also I think it's timely in terms of the federal role in infrastructure, as we talk about an infrastructure package that we hope to see come forward in the next few months or so. And I want to target at least my first two questions in that regard, and this is specifically to Mr. Doney. And just to provide just a little context or background, a community that I represent is the city of Lancaster, about 60,000 people in Pennsylvania. If you visit Lancaster now, again, this is happening in many areas, but specifically in my district, it's a vibrant downtown area that is important to the entire county. And that didn't just happen by accident. It was really the result of a lot of community leaders who focused on that for several decades, and we now see the outcome of that, and people recognize that is a very important development to the region as well as to the downtown. And it didn't come about entirely by private investment. It really was targeted. In this case, it was mostly state dollars that, if you look back, specifically a baseball stadium and a convention center, which would not have happened without targeted investment. It was a public-private partnership, and that's why I'm excited about what we're talking about in terms of our infrastructure package. We're talking about spurring private investment dollars, which neither of those projects that I mentioned would have happened without a public-private partnership, but neither would have a lot of other ancillary businesses and development occurred that didn't require any state dollars, but it was all private investment driven by the initial investment into the community. I'm not, I'm new here, I'm not as familiar with the federal role, and so I guess I'm interested in hearing from you about the role of the Economic Development Administration. What specifically can the Economic Development Administration provide that other agencies cannot? I wonder if you'd speak to that.
Well, I think in two respects, and it approaches the need for economic opportunity and healthy, vibrant communities and regions, as well as emergency preparedness. One is capacity on the ground. EDA invests in building that capacity. One thing about economic development is we cross just about every area. So we develop the relationships with our healthcare, with housing, with transportation, certainly with the business community, with education. Those relationships help us address things and creatively package things together. So capacity is one. Two is that last bit of money to make something happen. EDA tends to focus on those catalytic projects that you get one thing going and it gets the ball rolling. We have a revolving loan fund that is 20 years old. We've recycled that money many times. We average 17% into a deal so that we push the conventional lenders to do as much as possible. We push the business to raise as much equity as possible, and then we fill that gap. It's frustrating at times when we come here to Washington that we don't think the role of that is greatly appreciated. We're the deal makers there, and we're trying to close that last gap.
Yeah. I wonder if do you have, as we look at spurring additional public-private partnerships, do you have suggestions for improvements based on your experience to that agency or other federal agencies?
Well, two things. One, streamlining things at EDA. They have much lower staff than they used to have. The regulatory burdens certainly don't go away, environmental review and things like that. That's one of the reasons we've suggested the defederalization of the revolving loan funds. Again, our loan fund is 20 years old. We still have to file regular reports, and then EDA staff have to review those. The proposal that was before the House last year would have removed that for revolving loan funds that had proven themselves over a number of years to be performing well. So that would give them the flexibility there. The other is let EDA play its congressionally mandated role of being the lead agency in economic development and developing those relationships to eliminate stovepipes between other agencies. Usually when we're working on something, whether it be broadband, disaster recovery, or just trying to put a deal together, as you know from being mayor, we're cobbling together a whole variety of public and private resources. EDA is the one agency that has the flexibility to fill whatever gap that we have. It's really the only resource that we have that has that flexibility to fill that last gap.
Thank you. I see I'm out of time.
Thank you. I'm now going to begin a second round of questions if any other members want to participate. Mr. Hembree, are there ways in which we can ensure agencies like EDA and ARC encourage mitigation when funding disaster-related projects?
Absolutely, I think there are. I think there's probably both some requirements, maybe regulatory type requirements that could be put in place tied to funding levels. Well, I guess you would call that probably the stick approach. Probably what your local communities, and we would like to see more, is a sort of the carrot approach. And from that, what I mean, and traditionally what's been successful with some programs in the past where we've dealt with similar issues, is identifying what those communities' needs are in terms of potential mitigation, what happens, what if, and encourage that planning process beforehand. I think we as a nation and as regional development organizations and even as local governments have become much better at doing that. I think there's still a lot of work to go. So, I guess what the bottom line could be, one of the things that could be done is that could be tied to funds. Sort of getting back to the same thing we're talking about, in terms of the actual recovery funds to put in place, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Doney, in recent years, as you point out, EDA has served as an integrator of federal economic development programs, working with other agencies and streamlining the application process for distressed communities. Can you talk about why this role is important and how it can be strengthened?
Certainly. EDA plays again, that last gap role when it comes to infrastructure. It has the flexibility that if our need on a project is a sewer line or a water line, maybe it's a building renovation, maybe it's broadband, a whole variety of different things, usually at the scale that won't reach the level of other federal programs. EDA can fill that gap. The programs of economic adjustment have been particularly critical in my region. The U.S. economy, the global economy is so dynamic that the economic adjustment program allows us to develop plans and implement plans at the local level to react and take advantage of new market opportunities and address market challenges that come up. So the Public Works program is that last gap of infrastructure. I don't know where else to turn to if it's not EDA. It's not like we have choices. We turn to EDA because there's nothing else that we can do. We've exhausted everything at the local, regional, and state level. We're very creative at getting everything we can to put something together. We turn to EDA when there's no other resource left.
Thank you. Mr. Siegel, you highlight the significance of disaster mitigation in your testimony. Mitigation not only saves lives and reduces property damage, but it can also save jobs. Can you talk more about how mitigation is critical in economic development?
We've just completed a very intense community education and outreach program in the ACOG region. And we're actually going to be taking that across the local development districts through 52 counties in Pennsylvania. And the purpose of that was to hear from the businesses and the citizens about how we can plan for resiliency. It is a critical element of job retention and job creation. In terms of the retention, we've actually proposed and rolled out some concept ideas, suggesting offering tax credits, targeting revolving loan funds revenues to businesses in order to build resiliency into their facilities. The types of things we're looking at are relocation, flood proofing, those types of things, all of those things that would allow a business to come back into operation quickly after an event occurs. and we're utilizing the EDA revolving loan funds for that, as well as advocating for certain interest and tax credit benefits for those purposes.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Ranking Member Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Linkus. What aspects of the flood insurance program, if privatized, or let me ask the question like this. You recommend that the flood insurance program be privatized, but what would the current market for flood insurance, or would that current market for flood insurance be served under a privatization model?
Thank you. We are calling for increased privatization of the flood insurance program, not necessarily the complete elimination of the flood. Flood is a very difficult loss to model. That being said, I think the appetite of carriers and reinsurers would be quite healthy. We know that there is a significant capital surplus in both the reinsurance and carrier markets. Carriers are looking for areas to deploy that capital in order to serve markets, grow their market share. So I think it would be quite extensive. That being said, insurance companies are not going to take that first step to entering that risk until they understand fully the risk. And so that information coming to us, being allowed to set actuarially sound rates for the risk that is there, needs to be part of the reforms that to the overall protection of flood in the nation.
Would the private market be amenable to assuming the FEMA mapping process along with this privatization proposal?
Well, certainly, because we know that the better data we have, the better we can manage the overall risk. If we don't manage properly the risk of our company, small or large, we ultimately will go out of business. That's why we've been around for 175 years, because we look at the risk appropriately. Our owners are our policyholders. So I am not the owner of the company, I am the steward of the company. So the policyholders expect me to make sure that I'm mitigating the risk that ultimately protects their surplus, the policyholder's surplus. So I would see that the industry would enjoy engaging with the NFIP to make sure that the maps are correct, that they're updated on a frequent basis, and adapt to the changing climate that we see all around us that are driving more and more floods into these programs. I think there's an opportunity with the insurance industry coming in with its massive infrastructure of data that it can supplement and help not only policyholders at the home and business level, but also communities that are looking for ways to improve their infrastructures.
Ms. Granis, thank you, Mr. Linkus. Ms. Granis, what would privatization look like if it were to be, if it were to become the policy of the country?
I think there would be a couple things that I would look to in thinking about how the private insurance market would play a role within and to complement the NFIP. The first is the floodplain mapping program. You know, we want that information to be public. We want that information to be updated and accurate because it drives so many decisions about how we set insurance prices, where we build, how we build, who has to purchase insurance. So, you know, we want that information to be maintained as a public good. There's been proposals to include like a surcharge on policies to make sure that the floodplain mapping program continues to have the resources it needs. The second component that I would want to preserve is the role of the NFIP in encouraging communities to mitigate risk and to do things like have better land use practices in floodplains, have better codes and standards on the books. So we want to make sure that that public good is still preserved with a private role as well. And then I think the third prong of the flood insurance program that really has to be managed carefully is the affordability of flood insurance. This is the last line of defense for people if they are affected by flood insurance. This is the only money they have to rebuild. And so if those insurance prices go through the roof and lower income homeowners are not able to continue to maintain coverage or are priced out of their home, that will have significant resilience effects on communities and the ability of households to recover in the event of these extreme storms.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson, and I thank you all for your testimony today. If there are no further questions, I would ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing, and unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I would like to thank our witnesses again for their testimony today. If no other members have anything to add, this subcommittee stands adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.